Welcome, I'm Rabbi Phil Bressler of Beit Am in Corvallis, Oregon, and this is the daily summary video for the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch Yomi Daily Halakha Learning Project, covering the passage from Sivan 143, Seif 19, to Sivan 144, Seif 6. You can find links to the Hebrew and English text of this passage and to the calendar of upcoming passages in this video's description. We're going to wrap up talking about the mitzvah of Kibud Av Va'em, the mitzvah of honoring one's father and mother. This mitzvah also applies to beyond your immediate biological parents, also applies to your step-parents. At a minimum, while your bio-parent is still alive, it's proper to honor them, and it's proper to continue anyway after your bio-parent's death. Your older siblings, Kitzur just says brother, but I'm going to go ahead and include all other siblings, deserve honor, including half-siblings. In-laws and grandparents as well are covered by this mitzvah. All of these, of course, subordinate to honoring one's parents themselves. In addition to what you might call direct honoring of parents through direct action, it's also possible to honor them what you might call indirectly through being a good and upstanding person, engaging in Torah and Ma'asim Tovim, such that people will recognize you and praise you to them, and that's a way you can honor your parents by reflecting well on them. Also, honoring works both ways. A parent who loves and cares for their children will also engage in Torah and Ma'asim Tovim, so as not to disgrace their children. There's also an element of superstition, I would call it here, that children die because of the iniquity of their parents. Long-running debate in rabbinic literature about whether or not God extends punishment. It's presumed that evildoers, wicked people are punished for their sins, but whether God extends that punishment to subsequent generations, generally the idea is no, but also the Torah sort of implies that that's the case. So you get some element of that superstition even here in the mid-19th century Kitzur. And finally, Jews who convert to Judaism shouldn't curse or humiliate their non-Jewish parents. It doesn't appear that the mitzvah of Kibud Av Va'em extends to cover their non-Jewish parents, but it's still becoming to treat them with respect. Moving into a new Siman now, covering honoring one's rabbi, their teacher, the aged, the scholar, and the Kohen, that is the priest. So remember what I talked about a day or two ago about smashing values against one another to see what wins out? Well, a degree above honoring one's parents is honoring one's teacher. Specifically, your rabbi, that is the person who teaches you Torah. As the Kitzur says, and here they're quoting Talmud, your parent brings you to life in this world, but your rabbi brings you to life in Olam Haba, that is the world to come, some sort of idealized version of the future. We derive from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 32, which reads, Mipnei seva takum v'hadarta pnei zaken, you shall rise before the aged and show deference to the old. We derive from that two different things. It sounds like that verse is saying the same thing two different ways, which is, of course, impossible because one of the principles of Jewish scripture interpretation that we take for granted is that the Torah is never redundant. It never says the same thing twice. If two things sound similar, it must be coming to teach us two different things. So, seva, literally gray hair, is taken to mean someone who's elderly, while zaken is taken to mean which means literally just old, is taken to mean an experienced Torah scholar. And so the verse is taken to mean that we owe honor to both kinds of people, both to someone who is maybe younger than us, not necessarily our teacher, who is a distinguished scholar, and also we owe honor to someone who's older, but not necessarily a scholar. Again, it doesn't seem like the mitzvah applies strictly to non-Jews, but respecting and aiding non-Jewish elders is also worthy and good behavior. Now, one of the beneficial things about studying halakha, even if your purpose isn't to adhere strictly to every bit of it, is the way it helps, I think, expand our thinking and bring it from the abstract to the practical. So here's an example. When three people, one of whom is a rav, that is a rabbi, but also any teacher or scholar, when three people are walking together, the Rav should walk in the middle with the other two flanking and slightly behind them. There's a symbolic importance here in terms of visually demonstrating to others, who is the person, the distinguished person in that group. But it's also, I think, to a degree practical. There's a way the the Rav steers the whole group if they're out in front. The others are, in a posture of listening to them, not leading the discussion. All of these aspects are important when we think about what it means to honor someone. Degrading or humiliating a Talmid Chacham, that's the halachic word for a Torah scholar, is a serious transgression. It's not only a personal affront to that individual, but the act also, I think, involves some potent symbolism. It's almost like an assault on them is like an assault on God and Torah itself in some sense. The Kitzur cites a tradition that Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians in 586 BCE because of the way that the inhabitants treated their Torah scholars. Sif number 5 here is interesting. The Torah scholars afforded a degree of privilege in business. You can't try to directly compete with them. And the specific example in Kitzur here is selling the same merchandise that they do. Basically, if you do that, you enter the same competitive space, you're drawing business away from them. I think the idea is that because business is secondary to them while study is primary, we sort of have to enable their success without undue burden so that they're able to support themselves from basically a side business and spend the bulk of their time studying. This rule, though, is null if a non-Jew is also in that same sector. Non-competition from other Jews against the Talmid Hacham who's engaged in that business won't lead to that scholar's profit because they're already being competed with by the non-Jew. Important question, obviously, how does one qualify as a Talmid Hacham? So 3 factors go into that designation. Number 1, that person has to be competent to do lisa v'litein, give and take, that is, discussion and debate of Torah. Kitzur only says Torah here, but I think we can probably assume that they don't mean just the 5 books of Moses, but scripture, written scripture, and all it encompasses, as well as what was originally oral Torah and is now written down in the form of Mishnah and Talmud. Qualification number 2 is Mevin midato berov mikomot hashas ufoskim. So that person needs to understand mida'ato, like from their own knowledge, most of Shas, that is an abbreviation for the Shisha Starim, the 6 orders of Mishnah and Talmud, and also the Poskim. So these are halachic decisors. I think the reference here is to the classic codes of halacha, Mishnah Torah by Maimonides, Shulchan Aruch by Yosef Karo, things of that nature. Note, this doesn't necessarily convey to me like 100% comprehensive knowledge. It says Barov Mikomot, so a generally applicable knowledge of all those things is what's required. And finally, number 3, Torah study needs to be their main occupation. Having a side hustle is okay in order to support themselves and their family, but the goal, their goal as sort of an overall career can't be accumulating wealth. Their goal in their career has to be, preeminence in Torah study. Another privilege afforded to Talmidei Chacham apparently is an exemption from taxes and levies, even if they're wealthy. Remember, in this era, Jewish communities are mostly governing their own affairs, and so the Jewish community itself would be responsible for levying taxes and things like that. So this is essentially a form of communal support for Torah study in that community. The community pays the share of the Torah scholars in town so they can continue to study. This is, of course, subject to the discretion of elected leaders. And finally, one other footnote, scholars are compared to one another regionally and by city, not across regions. So my case, for example, is illustrative. I know that I am not remotely in the same league as rabbis I admire in other Oregon cities. But for intents and purposes, here in Corvallis, I'm the Talmid Hacham. I'm the scholar because I'm the rabbi of the community, and my level of knowledge is adequate for that title within my region. So if we were to gather, Talmidei Hacham from around Oregon, even though there's I'm sure many others who would really put me to shame, I think that would probably lift me up into that category. Note, I am not trying to in any way, inflate myself. Really, I know what I know, and I know what I don't know, and there's a degree of humility that has to be involved here. I don't pretend to be claiming any titles that I'm not worthy of. That's all for today, though. As always, our learning is dedicated to Rabbi Shlomo Gansfried, a real Talmid Chacham, the author of the Kitzur, and the historic Jewish community of Uzhhorod, Ukraine. See you tomorrow.